Welcome back to the Read and Rank podcast, folks. And tonight we are going to be doing our first ever author study. We're going to be talking about Tolkien, Fiest, Brooks, Goodkind, and Jacques, the five authors who's helped build modern fantasy. And of course, there were other ones like Mercedes Lackey, Piers Anthony, so on and so forth. But these are the five authors I grew up with because, eventually there was a time before Middle Earth, before the Fellowship walked toward Mordor, before rifts tore open between worlds, and before the Four Lands called another generation of heroes in a battle. Before Richard Rahl drew the Sword of Truth, and before warriors cried "Eulalela" from the walls of Redwall Abbey, there was fantasy myths, fairy tales. There was Beowulf, King Arthur, ancient gods, impossible heroes, or impossible creatures, heroic warriors, and kingdoms that are swallowed by history. But the massive, sprawling, shelf-bending fantasy worlds we recognize today, those really had to be built, and somebody had to lay the stones. Somebody had to prove to readers prove readers would follow an author across thousands of pages, multiple generations, invented histories, wars, kingdoms, languages, religions, magical systems, and entire civilizations that existed nowhere except inside the imagination. And tonight, for the first time ever, we here at the Read It Rand podcast are doing our first ever author study. Not a book review, not a ranking, not a tier list, and definitely not an episode where I'm going to sit here and tell you which one of these authors you're supposed to like. We're going to do something different. We're studying the architects, five writers, and five radically different approaches to writing fantasy. And they are five enormous fingerprints left across the entire genre. We got J.R.R. Tolkien, Raymond D. Feist, Terry Brooks, Terry Goodkind, and of course, the late great Brian Jacques. Because if you're going to understand where epic fantasy is going, sometimes you got to turn around and walk back through the ruins and figure out who built the kingdom in the first place. All right? So grab your sword, your spellbook, and your second breakfast. And apparently, if Brian Jacques has anything to say about it, grab them victuals. About 17 different kinds of bread, cheese, pie, cordial soup, and enough food to feed Redwall Abbey for the next 6 winters, because tonight we're going to study the Masters, and I think the first one we're going to start with is Gerald Tolkien, who is the founding father. And I want to start with him because he is somebody who is almost impossible to avoid when discussing epic fantasy. John Reynolds Rule Tolkien is a very important figure in this genre because saying Tolkien influenced modern fantasy is almost underselling what happened. Because Tolkien didn't simply sit down, during World War II or after when he started writing about this to cope with the war. He basically said, I need a wizard. He didn't say, I need a wizard, some elves, a dark lord, a magic object. No, his world building developed out of really something deeper. Tolkien studied language. He was a philologist. He studied language. Because to him, language wasn't decorative wallpaper he slapped on a Middle Earth after creating the story. It was part of the foundation. Like he literally went to college for it. And according to material published by the Tolkien estate, Tolkien had been developing his Elvish language for nearly 40 years by the time the Fellowship of the Ring appeared in 1954. And even more importantly, the languages actually preceded and helped generate the legendarium itself. Think about how backwards that sounds compared with the way many fantasy worlds are created today. Most of us would imagine first you create the kingdom, the characters, and the history. Then maybe you invent some cool words. Tolkien was doing something closer to here's the language now, who speaks it? Where do these people come from? What happened to their language over thousands of years? What other languages influenced it? What wars separated these people? What songs would they sing? What myths would survive? What places would their ancestors have named? And suddenly you've gone from creating words to creating civilization. That's why Middle Earth frequently feels less like something Tolkien invented and more like somewhere archaeologists discovered. You don't feel like the world began on page one. You feel like you really arrived unbelievably late. There were ruins everywhere. Songs refer to people you've never met. Characters mention ancient wars. Kingdoms have fallen. Languages have evolved. The bloodlines seriously matter. Objects have histories. Mountains have names. Forests remember things. And somebody somewhere probably has a 12-page family tree explaining exactly why all of it matters. That's the Tolkien effect. His scholarship in languages helped produce world building where culture isn't simply described, it is acclimated. And that's one of the biggest lessons modern fantasy authors can take from Tolkien. Deep world building isn't really necessarily about telling your reader everything. It's about convincing your reader that there is more, that beyond the mountain on the map is another history, and beyond that history is another civilization, and beyond that civilization is another myth. And Middle Earth has depth because Tolkien spent decades developing the linguistic and mythological foundation underneath it. And then we get one of Tolkien's greatest themes, which is power. Because The Lord of the Rings isn't simply about destroying an evil piece of jewelry. The One Ring represents temptation. It doesn't walk into the room saying, hello, I'm evil, I'm here. It offers you something, which is power. The ability to accomplish what you believe needs to be accomplished. That's why the ring is so dangerous. The temptation isn't necessarily would you like to become evil? It's wouldn't everything be easier if you were powerful enough to force the world to become what you think it should be? And that is a far more interesting concept because characters can desire power for reasons that initially appear noble. Boromir doesn't look at the ring simply because he woke up that morning and decided villainy sounded fun. He sees something that really might save Gondor. And Tolkien keeps asking the uncomfortable question: what happens when good intentions are handed absolute power? That's a question fantasy authors are still asking today. Then there's Tolkien's treatment of nature and industrialization. The Shire represents something intimate, green, agricultural, communal, and small. And however, meanwhile, throughout Tolkien's work, mechanicized destruction frequently accompanies corruption. Forests fall, land is scarred, war turns living landscapes into wastelands. And Tolkien doesn't need to stop the story every 15 pages and deliver an environmental lecture. The landscape itself communicates the loss. That's craftsmanship. And here's where the author study really gets interesting because Tolkien becomes so influential that the next generation of fantasy writers faces a problem. How do you write epic fantasy after Tolkien? Because without Tolkien literally wrote the playbook. And I think a lot of authors struggle with how do you follow Tolkien without simply rewriting Tolkien. And that brings us directly to chapter 2, which is Terry Brooks, who's the commercial catalyst. Because he emerges onto the scene in 1977. He arrives with a fantasy novel called The Sword of Shannara. And the Tolkien helped establish the modern creative blueprint for epic fantasy. Brooks helped demonstrate something critically important to the publishing business: that stuff could sell big. The Sword of Shannara became a major commercial success. Google Books biographical information on Brooks describes it as the first work of fiction to appear on the New York Times trade paperback bestseller list. And that really matters for this time period because you got to remember this is 1977. They don't have what we have today. You know, because we also need to separate two things in this study: artistic influence and commercial influence. They aren't necessarily the same. A writer can revolutionize how stories are written. Another writer can demonstrate that there's a gigantic, sustainable audience waiting to buy those stories. Tolkien demonstrated the extraordinary potential of secondary world fantasy. Brooks helped demonstrate to late 1970s publishing that Tolkien wasn't necessarily a one hit wonder. You know, readers wanted more fantasy, and this is where Brooks becomes fascinating because the Sword of Shannara has been compared to Lord of the Rings approximately what, like 4 billion times, maybe 5 billion, and I'm really probably I'm underselling it like crazy. And the similarities are almost impossible to ignore, but historically, focusing on all these only on those similarities can cause us to miss what happened afterward. Because honestly, Shannara evolves. And if you really want to get down to it, you can read Shannara as standalones. They're not a series. Because one of the most fascinating aspects of the Four Lands becomes the relationship between magic and science. And the further you read on in Brooks's work, you realize like there was an apocalyptic event that actually sent the world back to the Stone Age, where Paranor and the Druids and magic, especially as if you read books like Morgar or Anthrax and that kind of thing, you get that feel: the past and the future, civilization and destruction, fantasy and post-apocalypse. And as the mythology expands, readers discover that this magical fantasy landscape isn't necessarily disconnected from our own technological world. And the fantasy world grows out of catastrophe. Some civilization falls, nature reclaims, science becomes forgotten, magic rises, old technology becomes almost mythological. And suddenly Brooks is playing with the concept that I absolutely love in fantasy. Because what if the fantasy world isn't ancient history? What if it's our future? That creates a completely different flavor of world building. And it's something I struggled with when I first read Brooks when I was 13 and 15 because it sounded like a post-apocalyptic book in epic fantasy, but there was magic into it and it threw me for a loop. And there was some steampunk in there too with the voyage of the Jurley Shannara, you know, I believe. Um but instead of asking what ancient magical civilization existed before these people, Brooks can effectively ask what happens when people living thousands of years after technological civilization encounter fragments of something no longer understand. A machine can become an artifact. Technology can become legend. History can become mythology. And that blurring of science fiction and fantasy becomes part of Shannara's identity. There's also another theme that Brooks repeatedly turns to, which is inheritance. Not simply inheriting a sword, inheriting responsibility, mistakes, unfinished wars, and powers you didn't ask for, and a name that comes with expectations. Fantasy loves hidden heritage, especially when it comes to the Omsfords, and Shannara embraces it. Which brings me to something important about commercial fantasy. There's a tendency to act like popularity somehow automatically means artistic inferiority. Like, I don't buy that. Commercial storytelling teaches us something. It teaches us what ideas connect with enormous numbers of readers. Brooks really helped establish that readers would return to a fantasy world again and again. And once publishers see that, fantasy stops looking like an occasional gamble, it starts looking like a serious market. And that commercial door matters enormously for everyone who comes afterwards. Because then the 1980s arrive. Another author looks at epic fantasy and apparently says, okay, but what if the war doesn't stay on one planet? Which brings us to Raymond E. Feist, who is the master of scope. You know, because imagine standing in a medieval fantasy kingdom with knights, castles, magicians, armies, everything appears familiar, and then reality tears open, a rift appears, and through it comes another civilization, not simply another kingdom, another world. And welcome, this is where we get into the Rift War cycle with Raymond Feist, because his magician's, I think, apprentice arrives in 1982 and introduces readers to what becomes the enormous Rift War cycle, which is 34 books, which I have downstairs. But the origins of Midkemia are fascinating because this world didn't originally begin as a novel setting. Because according to Feist's official site, Midkemia grew out of a role-playing campaign developed by a group around the University of California in San Diego during the 1970s. Feist later used that setting as a historical faction for his fiction. Um, and suddenly, Feist's world building style makes a whole lot of sense because role playing worlds have to accommodate something novels don't always need, which is movement. Players have to go somewhere. Cities need to exist beyond the immediate plot. Political borders matter. Different regions need identities. History creates adventures. Trade matters. Wars change maps. Organizations have agendas, and perhaps most importantly, the world has to feel like it could continue doing things even if your character wasn't standing there. That DNA really survives in Midkemia. But then Feist does something especially clever. He introduces Kelawan, and Kelawan isn't just Midkemia wearing different clothes. Feist explained that Kelawan was, created more as a literary environment drawing partly on Asian cultures while also borrowing elements from several other cultural and literary inspirations. That's seriously significant because fantasy historically leaned heavily on medieval, European aesthetics. Feist creates conflict between worlds that borderline sci-fi, that don't really have different flags. They possess different social assumptions and different political structures and customs and military traditions and ways of understanding honor. So the Rift War isn't just good kingdom versus bad kingdom, it's also civilization encountering civilization. And neither side fully understands what it's really looking at. That creates cultural tension alongside military conflict. And then Feist keeps expanding. One generation becomes another. A young kitchen boy named Pug doesn't simply go on an adventure, save the king, come home, and roll credits. No, history continues. The characters age. Their children inherit worlds shaped by their parents. You know, Feist built on what Brooks laid with the Omsburgs. You know, these wars have consequences in the Rift War cycle decades later. Threats become increasingly cosmic, and the scale gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is what I mean when I call Raymond E. Feist the master of scope. He understands something that epic fantasy can do exceptionally well: time. Time itself can become part of your world building. Most stories follow characters. Massive fantasy sagas can follow civilizations. And think about that difference for a minute, though. Hold on. A character has an arc, a civilization has an era. A character experiences consequences for years. A civilization can experience consequences for centuries. And that's why multi generational fantasy can hit seriously different. You remember what the world looked like before. Then 20 years or 30 or 50 years pass, and suddenly you're seeing legends being created in real time. The hero from book 1 becomes the name characters whisper about in book 15. That's powerful, because Feist's approach also demonstrates one of the great dangers of enormous fantasy universes. Scale can become the enemy of intimacy. The bigger your conflict becomes, the easier it really is to forget the person standing in the middle of it. If every sequel introduces an even bigger god, an even bigger army, an even bigger dimension, eventually the reader can, I think, really become numb and overwhelmed. So the challenge is, how can you make the fate of the universe matter while still making us care about the kid who started in the kitchen? That's really the balancing act. And Feist's career is one enormous case study in that challenge. Which brings us really to an author who approaches fantasy from almost the opposite direction because instead of asking how large can fantasy become, Terry Goodkind asks, what if fantasy can become an argument? Which brings us to Terry Goodkind in chapter 4, who's the philosophical extremist. And we're going to get a little controversial. But I mean, come on. This is the Read and Rant podcast. You knew we weren't getting through an author story without somebody starting an argument like Terry Goodkind, you know, who's the author of Wizard's First Rule and the Sword of Truth series, with Richard Rawl, Colin Omnell, The Sword of Truth, Confessors, Wizards, Prophecy, Magic Wars, Tyrants, Fantasy Maps, Monsters, Ancient Powers, and Terry Goodkind essentially looked at that all of that and said, "I don't write fantasy." Um, we're going to talk about all that because Goodkind publicly resisted the fantasy label, arguing that his stories were primarily concerned with human themes, philosophy, romance, history, adventure, and ideas rather than fantasy for fantasy's sake. His comments become infamous among fantasy readers because because the Sword of Truth books employ so many recognizable conventions of epic fantasy, and I think that's actually worth studying beyond making jokes about it because Goodkind clearly saw the genre differently. To him, the magic wasn't necessarily the point. The philosophical conflict was. And nowhere is that clearer than his relationship with objectivism. Objective. I can't talk tonight. My bad. Let me take a drink. Uh, Objectivism. Goodkind openly discussed Ayn Rand and objectivist, philosophy. In a 2008 interview, he described it in extraordinarily admiring terms and acknowledged that Richard Rawl reflects aspect of his own objectivist thinking. At the same time, Goodkind insists his primary purpose was telling entertaining stories rather than teaching a philosophy class. And that tension is exactly why he's fascinating, for this study. Because the Sword of Truth series frequently isn't satisfied with asking, will the hero defeat the villain? It asks, which worldview deserves to win. Goodkind's characters can become vehicles for ideas about liberty, individualism, reason, self determination, personal responsibility, coercion, collectivism, and moral certainty. And depending on who you ask, that's either the reason the series becomes fascinating or the reason they threw the book across the room. That's what makes Goodkind such a polarizing figure. Subtlety is not exactly the word most critics of this philosophical writing would, choose. Goodkind's ideological conflicts can really become enormous. Characters don't simply disagree. Their philosophies can represent, existential threats. The villain doesn't really merely want your kingdom. He represents a way of thinking Goodkind wants the reader to confront. You know, and Richard really isn't simply wielding a sword. He's frequently wielding an argument. And here's the author study question. Should fantasy tell us what to think? Because Tolkien has philosophical ideas. I mean, he bases a lot of his writing on, Christian philosophy, and biblical, principles in the epistles. Even Brooks has philosophical ideas, as well as Feist, who has political ideas. Jacques absolutely has moral ideas. And every story these authors write contain values. But there's a difference between embedding ideas in a story and stopping the story so the ideas can stand under a spotlight. Goodkind pushes closer to that line than almost anyone on today's list, and that's why I call him the philosophical extremist. Not because readers have to disagree or agree with his worldview, but because he takes the philosophical dial, grabs it, and turns the dang thing till it breaks off. And there's actually something that authors can learn from that whether they love Goodkind or not, or can't stand him. You have to know what your story believes. You don't have to preach it. You don't have to write a 40-page speech explaining it, but know it. What does your hero believe about power, freedom, duty, sacrifice, love, violence, government, family, truth? Because when characters believe something strongly, conflict becomes deeper than you're the bad guy and I'm the good guy. It becomes your vision of the world cannot coexist with mine. That's powerful storytelling fuel. But there's a warning attached. If your philosophy completely consumes your characters, they can stop sounding like people. They start sounding like podiums. And that's the line every philosophical writer has to walk. Goodkind didn't always walk quietly either. Sometimes he kicked the dang door down. And whether you consider that bold, frustrating, fascinating, exhausting, or all four is part of why people are still arguing about these books today. But now we're going to go somewhere completely different. Put away the Sword of Truth. Let's close the rift. Let's leave, Mordor, the ring behind, because our final author asks an absolutely ridiculous question that somehow produced one of fantasy literature's most beloved worlds. And I will say this, and like a lot of people don't even know about Redwall, but what if epic fantasy was fought by mice? You know, because Brian Jacques, which is the anthropomorphic epicist with Redwall Abbey, with mice, badgers, otters, hares, squirrels, foxes, the long patrol, rats, stoats, weasels, excuse me, and enough food descriptions to make you put the book down every 5 minutes and start looking through your fridge like a starving medieval peasant. I know when I first read his books, and every time I heard victuals, I got hungry, and Brian Jacques just has that way with words to make you hungry. Um, and I think the first mistake too anyone can make with Redwall is assuming, oh, they're talking animals. This might be just cute little children's stories. Absolutely not. These woodland creatures go to war. There are sieges, battles, deaths, and gruesome deaths. Heroes, villains, prophecies, legendary weapons. Martin the Warrior, ancient warriors. There are generational histories, songs, riddles, feasts, tragedies, sacrifices. And I'm gonna be honest, when I read Redwall, I was hooked on the mystery. I always felt like there was a secret treasure trove or beneath that Redwall, or they're gonna the adventure just it consumes you, and there's enough battle cries to wake up your neighbors. And what Jocks accomplished is fascinating. He took the emotional machinery of epic fantasy and he changed the scale. Instead of knights defending Camelot, mice defend an abbey. And instead of ancient royal swords, you get the legendary sword of Martin the Warrior. And instead of human kingdoms building dynasties, woodland communities preserve generations of memory. But the emotional stakes really don't shrink either. That's the trick. The characters are small, but the story isn't. And the origin of Redwall makes Jacques' descriptive writing even more meaningful. Because according to the official Brian Jacques website before he passed a couple years ago, rest in peace, he was an amazing author. He originally wrote Redwall for children at Liverpool's Royal Wavertree School for the Blind, a school he encountered while working as a milk delivery driver because his first intended audience included blind kids. Jacques deliberately made the writing intensely descriptive, essentially painting the world through language. And now suddenly, the food makes sense, the sounds make sense, the textures made sense, the smells made sense. Redwall doesn't simply tell you there was a feast. Brian Jacques basically drags you into the Great Hall, sits you down at the table, and says, okay, you're going to smell this bread. You're going to taste this pie. You're going to hear the mugs hit the table. You're going to know exactly what's in this soup. And by page 247, even page 12, you're ordering groceries, man. You're making yourself a cheesecake. And I'm going to tell you why that's brilliant. Because food in Redwall isn't just food, it's civilization. And I want you to think about what the Abbey represents for a minute. It represents safety, community, tradition, hospitality, harvest, shared labor, generational memory. Because when villains threaten Redwall, they aren't simply threatening a building, they're threatening a way of life. That feast matters because the feast represents what the heroes are defending. They're defending the right to sit together again. They're defending children who deserve to grow up safely. They're defending songs, recipes, stories, gardens, friendship, and their home. And suddenly, that enormous description of strawberry cordial isn't pointless world building. It is literally emotional architecture. That's something I think modern fantasy writers can really learn from Brian Jacques. They don't simply tell us what's at stake. Let us live there first. If you're going to destroy the village, make me love the dang bakery. Brian Jacques describes scones in such a way, I want a frickin' cinnamon roll, you know? And if you're going to burn the kingdom down, show me the festival. If you're going to threaten someone's home, show me why they call it home. That's how stakes in a story become emotional. Redwall also creates multi-generational mythology. Martin the Warrior simply becomes more than a character. He becomes a memory, a symbol of hope and courage and legacy. And different books occur in different eras. Heroes become legends. Legends inspire new heroes. And that's one area where Jacques unexpectedly connects back to Tolkien and Fiest. History and memory matter. And the world existed before the current protagonist, and hopefully it will exist after them. Which brings us to chapter 6. When you put all 5 authors on the table, not literally, that would be a strange podcast, but look at really what each one represents. We got Tolkien, who represents language with fantasy as mythology, language creating culture, history creating depth, the world extending far beyond the boundaries of the current story. Then we got Brooks, he expresses accessibility and commercial momentum. Fantasy proving it could command an enormous modern audience, with old archetypes reintroduced to new generations, and magic colliding with forgotten science. Then we have Feist, who brings scale to the table, world against world, generation against after generation, political consequences stretching across decades, characters aging while history keeps moving. And then we got Goodkind, who brings ideology to the table, and he brings fantasy as philosophical confrontation, and heroes and villains fighting not simply over territory, but over competing definitions of freedom, morality, truth, and human purpose. And finally, we have Brian Jacques, who brings community. You know, Fantasy doesn't require human heroes. It doesn't require enormous kingdoms. It doesn't require the fate of the universe. And sometimes one abbey is not enough. One family is not enough. And a home is not enough. Because scale doesn't determine emotional importance. And here is what I find fascinating. These five authors look incredibly different, when you put them all together. Tolkien was a scholar and a philologist. Brooks was trained as a lawyer. Feist emerged from a collaborative, role-playing environment. Goodkind openly foregrounded philosophical concerns. Jacques wrote with intensely sensory language shaped partly by the audience for whom Redwall was originally created. They all have different lives, styles, and worlds, but they're all wrestling with versions of the same fundamental question. Why should we as readers care about an imaginary world? Tolkien says because it has history. Brooks says because its people inherit the consequences of the past. Feist says because history continues beyond a single generation. Goodkind says because ideas have consequences. And Jacques says because this imaginary place can feel like home. And that is fantasy. And that brings us to, chapter 7 and the problem I have with a lot of modern fantasy authors and what modern fantasy authors can truly learn from them. And here's where I want to bring this into the present too, because studying older fantasy shouldn't really be an exercise in reminiscence or nostalgia. We're not here to say everything old was perfect and everything new sucks. That's lazy. I think fantasy really evolved because writers challenged what came before them, and the writers were discussing, weren't perfect either. Every one of them has critics. Tolkien really gets criticized for pacing, and that's one of my biggest concerns with Tolkien. His writing is a little dry. Brooks gets criticized for similarities to Tolkien, which I don't agree with. And Feist's enormous scope can intimidate readers because he's a 34 book cycle. Um, he really remains intensely polarizing. And some readers find Jacques' repeated, heroic structures predictable. Fine. Great authors can have weaknesses. We all do. You know, Influential authors can have weaknesses. Those statements can coexist. And the goal of studying authors isn't worship, it's understanding. So if you're an indie author listening to this episode of this podcast, here's what I want you to take away from these five writers. From Tolkien, build underneath your story. Your reader doesn't need a 900-page encyclopedia, but readers should understand why your world works. Know where the names came from. Know who fought the old war. Know why two kingdoms hate each other. Know what the ruined tower used to be. You don't have to explain everything. You don't have to go off the left field with redundancy. Sometimes one broken statue beside the road can imply 500 years of history. From Brooks, never underestimate accessibility. You don't get bonus points because your fantasy requires a doctorate to understand page one. Archetypes exist because archetypes work. The challenge isn't always inventing something nobody has ever imagined. Sometimes the challenge is taking something familiar and making the reader emotionally invested again. And you could take away from Feist is think beyond the immediate adventure. If your series spans decades, let the world change. Government shouldn't freeze. Borders shouldn't freeze. Characters shouldn't freeze. Children should grow up. Heroes should grow old. Political victories should create unintended consequences. History should honestly move. And from Goodkind, you need to learn and know what your characters believe, not just what they want. There's a difference. Like, I want to defeat the Emperor is a goal. I believe no human being should have absolute authority over one another is a worldview. Give your characters beliefs, give them personality, and suddenly choices become complicated. But don't forget, readers came for a story, not compulsory philosophy 101. And for Jocks, make the reader love what you're threatening. I cannot emphasize this enough. A million dead imaginary soldiers mean nothing if they're numbers. One character setting an extra plate at dinner for somebody who never comes home, that can destroy you. That's emotional storytelling. Because, sometimes fantasy discussions become obsessed with determining who copied whom. But influence matters, absolutely. But, reading is subjective. Literature isn't a straight line, it's a family tree. Myth influenced Tolkien. Tolkien influenced generations. And those generations influenced other generations. Tabletop gaming influenced Feist. Publishing success created opportunities for more writers. Children's adventure stories intersected with epic fantasy. Philosophy entered sword and sorcery. Science fiction collided with magical worlds. And today, fantasy authors have access to all of it. An indie author sitting at a laptop in 2026 can draw inspiration from Tolkien's linguistic depth, Brooks' accessibility, Feist's scope, and Goodkind's ideological conflict, and Jack's emotional sense of home. And then add anime, video games, D&D, history, romance, horror, science fiction, mythology from cultures all around the world, and create something completely new. That's why I don't believe fantasy is dying. I don't think we've run out of worlds. We barely scratched the surface. The tools keep multiplying. The question is what the next generation does with them. All right? And here's my final rant. Who really built modern fantasy? So who is the greatest? Tolkien, Feist, Brooks, Goodkind, or Jacques? I'm not answering that. I'm gonna be honest. That's an argument for a whole different podcast. But I honestly also think that's the least interesting question we could ask. I think here's the better question. What did each one leave behind? Tolkien left us languages echoing through imaginary history. Brooks helped leave the publishing industry undeniable evidence that readers would show up for epic fantasy. Feist left rifts connecting civilizations, generations separated by decades. Goodkind left readers arguing about philosophy, individualism, morality, and whether the man who wrote Wizard's first rule was allowed to insist he wasn't writing fantasy. And Brian Jacques, he left an abbey, a sword, and a warrior named Martin. Generations of heroes. And apparently enough imaginary food to cater the entire fantasy genre. But together, they demonstrate something much, much bigger. Fantasy isn't escapism because it means nothing. Fantasy works because imaginary worlds give us another place from which to examine the real one. Power, greed, war, friendship, industrialization, freedom, duty, community, legacy, death, courage, hope, home. Those aren't imaginary. The dragons might be. The talking mice might be. The magical swords definitely are, but the questions, those are ours. And every generation gets to answer them again. And somewhere, a reader opens The Hobbit for the first time. Somebody discovers the Sword of Shannara. Somebody walks their first rift with Pug. Someone picks up Wizard's first rule and discovered Richard and Colin. And somewhere, a kid walks through the gates of Redwall Abbey. They don't know they're studying fantasy history. They don't care. They only know one thing. Their world disappeared, and another one took its place. Maybe that's the greatest trick any fantasy author ever learned. Not how to invent magic, not how to draw a map and put it in the front of a book, not how to create an ancient language, but how to convince someone sitting safely in our world that for the next few hundred pages, another world is so real that this one doesn't matter. And that is exactly why we're studying the people who built them. All right? That brings us to the very end of the very first Read It and Rant podcast author study, and I want to know what you think. Which one of these five authors had the greatest impact on fantasy? Was it Tolkien, Brooks, Feist, Goodkind, or Jacques? And more importantly, who should enter the author study next? Do we tackle Robert Jordan, Ursula K. Le Guin, George R. R. Martin, Michael Moorcock, David Eddings, R.A. Salvatore, Robin Hobb, Brandon Sanderson, Mercedes Lackey, Piers Anthony, or do we go completely off the beaten path and start digging into authors who never get enough credit for shaping the genre? Let me know. Because if you enjoyed this first author study, we're just getting started, all right? Make sure you follow the Read It Rant podcast on Spotify and Facebook. Subscribe on YouTube, smash that button. And follow us on TikTok for book reviews, author interviews, indie author spotlights, fantasy discussions, hot takes, and plenty more. Because around here, we don't worship the bestseller lists. We don't automatically hate what's popular. We don't follow trends and tropes. We don't pretend classics are flawless. And we sure as hell don't sugarcoat anything, all right? Until next time, keep turning pages, keep discovering worlds, keep supporting the authors who build them, and never stop asking why the stories we love become the stories, we love. This has been the Read It Rant podcast. Embrace the rant. Read It and Rant is out.